I never believed in God. Not once in my 40-something years had I ever thought there was something bigger than us watching over humanity. Religion was just another way people dealt with fear of death. That's what I told myself every single day. Then everything changed in one night. I was alone in my house, staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. Sleep had become impossible. For months, something had been eating away at me from the inside. Not work stress, not money problems, something deeper, the weight of existence itself. Every decision I made affected millions of people. Every word I spoke moved markets. Every choice rippled through countless lives. The responsibility was crushing me, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the emptiness. I had everything a person could want, yet I felt completely hollow, like I was just going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Each morning felt identical to the last. Each achievement felt meaningless the moment I accomplished it. That night, something inside me finally snapped. I found myself asking questions I'd never asked before. What was the point of any of this? Why did I keep pushing forward when nothing seemed to matter? What happens when we die? Do we just disappear forever? These weren't the kind of questions I was used to asking. I was a practical person. I dealt with facts, data, and logic. But logic wasn't helping me anymore. I walked to my window and looked up at the stars. Space had always fascinated me, but now it looked different. Instead of seeing opportunity and exploration, I saw infinite darkness. Cold, empty, meaningless darkness. That's when I heard it. A voice in my head, clear as day. You're looking for me. I spun around, thinking someone had broken into my house. But I was completely alone. The voice hadn't come from outside. It had come from somewhere inside my mind. My hands started shaking. This wasn't possible. I didn't believe in voices from God or supernatural experiences. But I couldn't deny what I'd just heard. The voice spoke again. You've been searching for meaning in all the wrong places. I sat down hard on my couch, my mind racing. Was I losing my sanity? Was the stress finally getting to me? But the voice felt different from my own thoughts. It felt external, like someone else was speaking directly into my consciousness. Who are you? I whispered into the empty room. The response came immediately. You know who I am. And somehow, impossibly, I did know, even though I'd never believed, even though I'd spent decades dismissing religion as primitive thinking. I knew exactly who was speaking to me. The realization terrified me more than anything I'd ever experienced. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was just stress hallucinations, my brain playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when the voice returned, stronger this time. Look around you, Elon. Really look. I set down my mug and did what the voice asked. I looked at my kitchen, my house, my life, everything I'd built, everything I'd accomplished. But instead of seeing success, I saw something else entirely. I saw how isolated I'd become, how disconnected from real human relationships, how focused I was on the future, that I'd forgotten to live in the present. This isn't the life I wanted for you, the voice continued. What do you want from me? I asked out loud, feeling ridiculous for talking to empty air. I want you to stop running from me. That hit me like a punch to the gut. Running? I wasn't running from anything. I was building the future. I was solving humanity's biggest problems. I was making a difference. But as soon as I thought those words, I knew they weren't entirely true. I was running. I'd been running my entire life, running from deeper questions about purpose and meaning, running from the possibility that there might be something bigger than myself. The voice spoke again. You think you're in control, but you're not. You never have been. This made me angry. Control was everything to me. I'd built my entire life around being in control of my destiny, my companies, my future. The idea that I wasn't actually in control challenged everything I believed about myself. Prove it, I said defiantly. What happened next changed everything. My phone rang. It was my assistant, telling me about a problem that had come up overnight. A critical system failure that threatened everything I'd been working on for years. Something that should have been impossible As I dealt with the crisis over the next few hours, more problems kept emerging. Things that were completely out of my control, failures that made no logical sense. It was like the entire universe was conspiring to show me how little control I actually had. By the end of the day, I was exhausted and humbled. Everything I thought I could control had fallen apart in ways I never could have predicted. That evening, the voice returned. Do you understand now? I did understand. For the first time in my life, I understood that there were forces at work beyond my comprehension, beyond my control. The question was whether I was ready to accept that reality. I'm not the kind of person who takes things on faith. If God was real, if Christianity was true, I needed evidence. So I did what I always do when faced with a problem. I researched everything. I started reading the Bible, not as a believer, but as a skeptic looking for holes in the story. I expected to find contradictions, impossibilities, and ancient superstitions that would prove the whole thing was made up. Instead, I found something that shook me to my core. The more I read, the more the pieces started fitting together. The prophecies that came true hundreds of years later. The historical accuracy that archaeologists kept confirming. The complexity of the message that seemed impossible for primitive people to have invented. But it wasn't just the intellectual evidence that got to me, it was the personal relevance. Every story I read seemed to be speaking directly to my situation. The successful people who lost their way, the powerful leaders who discovered they needed something greater than themselves, the wealthy individuals who found that money couldn't fill the emptiness inside them. It was like reading my own biography, written thousands of years before I was born. The voice hadn't spoken to me in days, but I could feel a presence. Like someone was watching me as I studied, guiding my understanding, helping me see things I would have missed on my own. I started having dreams. Vivid, detailed dreams that felt more real than my waking life. In these dreams, I was walking through ancient Palestine, witnessing events from the Bible firsthand. I saw things that no movie or book had ever described, details that were too specific and consistent to be just random brain activity. In one dream, I was standing in a crowd, listening to Jesus speak. But it wasn't the sanitized, peaceful Jesus from Sunday school pictures. This was a man with incredible authority and power. When he looked at me, it felt like he was seeing straight through to my soul. He said, "I've been waiting for you to find me." I woke up with tears on my face. I never cry. But something about that dream had broken through every wall I'd built around my emotions. The research continued for weeks. I read everything I could find: Christian theology, atheist critiques, historical analyses, scientific studies. I talked to pastors, rabbis, philosophers, and scientists. What I discovered was that the more I learned about Christianity, the more it made sense of everything else in my life. All the restlessness, the searching, the feeling that something was missing, it all pointed to the same conclusion. I had been created for a relationship with God, and nothing else would ever satisfy that need. The evidence was overwhelming, but evidence wasn't enough. I needed something more personal. I decided to test God directly. If he was real, if he really cared about me personally, then he would respond to a direct challenge. I went to the same window where I'd first heard the voice weeks earlier. I looked up at the stars and spoke out loud. "If you're real, prove it. Show me something that will remove all doubt." I waited for a voice, a sign, some kind of supernatural experience. Instead, I got silence. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I started to feel foolish. Maybe I'd been deluding myself. Maybe the voice had just been stress after all. I went to bed, disappointed and confused. The next morning, I got a call that changed everything. My brother called to tell me that our father, who I hadn't spoken to in years, was in the hospital. He was dying. The old me would have seen this as just bad timing. But something inside me knew this was the answer to my challenge. God wasn't going to give me a magical sign. He was going to give me something much more important, an opportunity to experience his love through the most difficult situation of my life. I flew to South Africa immediately. When I walked into that hospital room and saw my father, weak and vulnerable, something broke open inside my chest. All the anger and resentment I'd carried for years suddenly seemed so small and meaningless. My father looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, son, for everything. In that moment, I understood what forgiveness really meant, not just the concept, but the actual experience of it. The weight that lifted off my shoulders was indescribable. Years of bitterness just vanished. But that wasn't the most powerful part. As I sat beside his bed, holding his hand, I felt a presence in that room. The same presence I'd been sensing for weeks, but stronger now, more tangible. It was like being wrapped in invisible arms of pure love. My father squeezed my hand and said, "There's something different about you. You seem peaceful." I hadn't told him anything about my spiritual journey. He had no way of knowing what I'd been going through, but somehow he could see the change in me. That night, as I prayed beside his bed, the first time I'd ever prayed in my life, I felt God's presence so strongly it took my breath away. Not as a voice in my head this time, but as a living reality surrounding both of us. My father passed away 3 days later, but instead of feeling devastated, I felt profound gratitude. Gratitude for the reconciliation we'd experienced. Gratitude for the love that had filled those final days. Gratitude for the clear demonstration that God was not only real, but intimately involved in the details of my life. The challenge had been answered, just not in the way I'd expected. After my father's funeral, I returned home a completely different person. The emptiness that had plagued me for months was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. But the real changes were just beginning. The first thing I noticed was how differently I saw people. Before, I'd viewed most interactions through the lens of efficiency and productivity. Now, I found myself actually caring about the individuals I worked with, not just their output, but their well-being, their families, their personal struggles. My assistant noticed the change immediately. "You seem calmer," she said one morning, "more present." She was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly thinking about the next project, the next milestone, the next achievement. I was actually experiencing the moment I was in. The voice returned one evening as I was reading the Bible. "Now you're beginning to understand what life is really about." "What is it about?" I asked. "Relationships. First with me, then with others. Everything else is just details." This revelation hit me hard because it went against everything I'd built my identity around. I'd always measured success by achievements, innovations, and impact on the world. But God was telling me that none of that mattered compared to the quality of my relationships. I started reaching out to people I'd neglected for years. Old friends, family members, even former colleagues I'd had disagreements with. In every conversation, I felt God's presence guiding my words, helping me to listen rather than just talk. The responses were incredible. People kept saying the same thing. "What happened to you? You're so different." But the most profound change was in how I viewed my work. Instead of being driven by ego and the need to prove myself, I began to see my capabilities as gifts meant to serve others. Every decision started with the question, how can this help people? How can this show God's love? This shift in perspective led to changes that surprised even me. I started treating employees differently, making decisions based on what was right rather than just what was profitable, and approaching problems with a sense of service rather than conquest. The voice spoke to me regularly now, usually during quiet moments of prayer or Bible reading. It wasn't audible like that first night, but it was unmistakable. A gentle guidance that helped me navigate decisions, both large and small. One evening, I realized something that took my breath away. I was happy, not the temporary satisfaction of achieving a goal, but deep, lasting contentment. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't constantly searching for something more. I had found what I'd been looking for without even knowing I was looking for it. 3 months after my father's death, I had what I can only describe as a vision. I was praying in my study when suddenly I wasn't in my house anymore. I was standing in a place of incredible light and beauty, not like anything on earth, but somehow familiar. In front of me was a figure I immediately recognized as Jesus, though he looked nothing like the paintings in churches. He was radiating power and love in a way that should have been overwhelming, but instead felt like coming home. "Do you understand now why I called you?" he asked. "I'm beginning to," I replied. You were never meant to carry the weight of the world alone. That was always my job. Your job is simply to love me and let me work through you. But why me? Why did you choose to reveal yourself to someone who spent so long rejecting you? Jesus smiled, and that smile contained more joy than I'd ever experienced. Because I don't call the qualified, I qualify the called. Your journey away from me was necessary for you to appreciate the journey back. What do you want me to do now? Be yourself, but be yourself in relationship with me. Let people see what it looks like when someone successful and intelligent chooses to follow me. Show them that surrendering to God isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength possible. I'm scared, I admitted. What will people think? What will this do to my reputation? The people who matter will understand. And those who don't understand yet, well, your example might help them find their way to me too. The vision ended, but the conversation continued in my heart. I spent the next several hours praying and thinking about what this meant for my life going forward. I realized that God wasn't asking me to abandon everything I'd built or completely change who I was. He was asking me to be the same person, but with Him at the center instead of myself. The difference was profound. Instead of being driven by fear, ego, and the need to prove myself, I would be motivated by love, service, and the desire to honor God with my abilities. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to publicly embrace Christianity, not gradually or quietly, but boldly and clearly. I was going to let the world know that Elon Musk had chosen to follow Jesus Christ. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with more excitement than I'd felt about anything in years. The next morning, I knew what I had to do, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy. Going public with my faith meant facing criticism from people who'd respected my scientific rationality. It meant being judged by religious people who might question my sincerity. It meant opening myself up to mockery, skepticism, and endless scrutiny. But as I prayed about it, the voice of God was clear. Fear of man is a trap. Fear of me is the beginning of wisdom. I understood. I'd spent my entire life worrying about what people thought of me, trying to maintain an image of control and self-sufficiency. But that image had been a prison. True freedom would come from being honest about who I really was and what I really believed. I decided to start with the people closest to me, my children, my friends, my key employees. The reactions were mixed, but generally positive. Some were surprised. Others said they'd sensed something different about me lately. My oldest son asked the question I'd been dreading. Dad, are you sure this is real? You've always been so logical about everything. I looked at him and realized this was the most important conversation of my life. Not a business meeting or a product launch, but a chance to share the most valuable truth I'd ever discovered with someone I loved. Son, I've never been more sure of anything. For the first time in my life, everything makes sense. All the success in the world couldn't fill the emptiness I had inside. Only God could do that. He nodded slowly. You do seem happier, Dad. More peaceful. That conversation gave me the courage I needed for the bigger step. I decided to share my story publicly, not through a press release or corporate announcement, but through a personal video where I could explain exactly what had happened and why I'd made this choice. As I prepared to record that video, I felt God's presence stronger than ever. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who was watching, everyone who was struggling with the same emptiness I'd experienced, everyone who was searching for meaning and purpose. The video went viral within hours of being posted. The responses ranged from supportive to hostile to curious. But the most meaningful messages came from people who said my story had given them hope, had made them reconsider their own relationship with God, had helped them feel less alone in their spiritual search. That's when I fully understood why God had chosen to reveal Himself to me. It wasn't because I was special or deserving. It was because my platform could reach people who might never set foot in a church, people who'd written off Christianity as irrelevant to modern life. Now, months later, I can say with complete certainty that choosing Christianity was the best decision I've ever made. Not because it made my life easier, it didn't. Not because it solved all my problems. It didn't do that either. I chose Christianity because it's true, because God is real, because Jesus Christ really did die for my sins and rise again, because the emptiness I felt my entire life was actually a God-shaped hole that only He could fill. Most importantly, I chose Christianity because God first chose me. He pursued me when I was running from Him. He spoke to me when I wasn't listening. He loved me before I loved Him back. That's the real reason I chose Christianity, not because of intellectual arguments or social pressure or emotional manipulation. I chose it because I encountered the living God, and once that happens, there's really no other choice you can make. The search is over. I found what I was looking for, and now I get to spend the rest of my life discovering just how deep and wide and amazing this relationship with God really is.